The best characters in literature are often the villains, and there's a reason they tend to be far more compelling than the heroes. We usually think of villains as simple foils for our heroes, characters who drive the plot, challenge the hero's morality, and raise the stakes, but a truly great villain is so much more than that. The greatest villains in literature reflect the anxieties of the era that created them. They reveal the fears and the desires, the insecurities, and everything that society is trying to hide. All of the ghosts, all of the skeletons in the closet are revealed through brilliantly constructed villains. So in this video, I want to explore the true role of the villain in storytelling, how monsters change over different eras, and what that tells us about those different eras, and what makes literary villains unforgettable. So, villains are often the most memorable part of the story. When you think about The Silence of the Lambs as an example, you don't remember Clarice Starling as much, right? The idealistic young woman. You remember the psychopath, Hannibal Lecter, the ex-psychiatrist who eats his victims, right? I mean, that's literally what comes to your mind. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason we remember the Joker more than we remember Batman, right? Batman is, as interesting a character as he is, so flat in comparison to the Joker, who's a super dynamic villain that is an agent of chaos, essentially. So why? Why do we remember villains so much more than we remember heroes? Well, I think there's a number of reasons for that. Often, the hero is an ordinary person walking the straight and narrow path that we all walk, of morality, of trying to do the right thing, of trying to understand our role in this world, and obviously following the hero's journey, something people don't always like to hear, but that's true in a lot of fiction, right? But the villain is a self-proclaimed moral exception to the rule. Think of Dostoevsky, right? Raskolnikov's idea, the great man who can rise above and do some immoral action. That's a core characteristic of most villains and many anti-heroes. So a villain walks to the tune of a different drummer, whereas all of the heroes are more or less kind of archetypal. There's a lot more ways to do something wrong, and a lot more interesting ways to do something wrong than there are ways to do it right, to stay on the moral track. And so I think that's part of the reason why heroes are so much less compelling than villains. Think about the way Tolstoy opened Anna Karenina. He really understood this on a deep level, right? All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. I would adjust this and paraphrase this to say that all heroes are alike and all villains are different, or all villains are unsuccessful in their own way. Even if they're successful, like they're rich or whatever, they're unsuccessful because they're not living the moral life. They're not living a good life. They've fallen off, whether it's through nihilism or it's through greed or whatever reason the villain has. But we do need both, right? If we're going to learn anything, if we're going to get any growth out of a story, we need heroes to preserve the moral order, but we also need villains, not just to challenge the order and to offer different interesting deviations from the path. We need them to expose or uncover truths that we didn't know were just below the surface. So, one more thing I guess I should say before we continue on here is the foil. What is a foil? A foil is a character who contrasts another. So think white hat, black hat, that kind of stereotype, right? The tough guy who has standards and the tough guy who doesn't have any standards and goes, he's the evil one because he's the one who doesn't have any standards. Whereas the other guy, even though he was a tough guy and he was, not necessarily the good man, he had certain standards which made him the hero, right? We see this a lot in certain genres. I think of the Western as an example, but there's a lot of other genres where it's very cut and paste what it looks like. But life is obviously way more complicated than this. And so when we look at different heroes and different villains, obviously we don't want to see something that is just an archetype of a genre. And that's part of the reason why I think so many people misunderstand villains. We think of villains as archetypes. It's sometimes okay to think of a hero as an archetype, but it's never okay to think of a villain as an archetype. Villains need to be interesting. They need to be compelling. They need to drive us because they are the spice of the vast majority of stories that we read. I can't think of a story I've read that I've really loved, that's been really meaningful, that hasn't had at least, even if it's not an explicit villain, at least a character with compelling villain-like characteristics, right? You have to have something. You have to have conflict. You can't just have a boring, okay, I know what's going to happen story. I think often of the line for Hamlet, with where he's speaking about his uncle, that he says that one may smile and be a villain, and his uncle, of course, spoiler alert, had murdered his father and became the king, and so the idea of that villain in Hamlet. I mean, one of the things that makes Hamlet compelling is that Hamlet is his own villain in a way because he contains multitudes inside of his own mind, right? So there are, of course, villains within the story which are necessary, but that's one example where maybe the villain is a little less compelling. But great villains reveal something uncomfortable about humanity, whether it's an internal villain, a part of a person, or an external monster. So, first big section here, I want to look at why villains matter. The biggest mistake we make is writing villains as just evil, right? Nobody sees himself as a villain. Nobody sees himself as evil. A compelling antagonist has to believe that they're justified, right? If they don't do this, then there's no reason why we believe their actions, why we believe they would take those actions. We could also have them stop caring about justifications entirely. A nihilist could be a villain, absolutely, and this is something we see in great works of literature quite often. The villains do challenge the values. They obviously have to fight against the heroes that represent these social ideals, and they test those ideals. But through testing them, we're able to refine whether we actually believe that this is a value worth upholding. And that's why I think villains are so compelling, right? They feel so alive. They're not constrained by morality. They're free in a way that all of us maybe wish to a certain extent we were, but we don't truly wish we were. At least hopefully we don't, because things would become chaotic very quickly. But the hero, as much as we agree with the hero, we don't read the story for the hero. We read it to see how the hero is able to overcome the compelling fight or the compelling rationalizations of the villain, or fail in doing so, right? We can explore lots of things, but Stephen King, he wrote a book on writing, and he's written a lot in his, he writes a lot, obviously, about the art, the craft of writing. And one of the things he said that really resonated with me was monsters are real and ghosts are real too. They live inside us and sometimes they win. I think that's so important because it's not just that the hero is going to win against the villain. I mean, that would be, nobody would read anything if that was always what happens. But it's the struggle, it's the wrestle, it's that grappling that makes it worth the fight. The lemon the juice is worth the squeeze, as it is. But another thing that makes villains really fascinating is they change with history. So ancient monsters, for example, if we take from the Odyssey, we take the Cyclops. Ancient societies had this need for order. Order was so important, and chaos maybe was the thing they feared above anything else. At least that's one way to read it, right? Obviously, there's so many other ways to read this, but in ancient societies where survival depended on hospitality and tribal law and divine favor and civilization, the Cyclops violates all of this, right? He eats his guests, he ignores the gods, he's brute force without morality. And ancient monsters, I think they were so often these giant physical abominations because ancient fears were giant and physical, right? Starvation and war and famine and violence and wilderness and collapse of order, right? Odysseus has to defeat him through intelligence. And the idea is civilization overcoming barbarism. So it makes sense. It's a classic story, but the villain is compelling, right? Because it challenges our notion of, where we're going. But that's early, right? As we go throughout time, later villains become more psychological, and I think they become more interesting. If we look, for example, at Dracula and the Victorian fears that Dracula represented, now we're talking, right? Dracula is not just a vampire. Of course, he's a vampire, but I think he's really a reflection of all of these Victorian anxieties related to sexuality and social norms, related to, I don't know if it's like fair to say a fear of the feminine, but certainly a kind of a desire to hide or to not really deal with the facts of the physical facts of the feminine, which is why I think there's so much blood in a lot of horror and a lot of fiction, especially in Victorian fiction, right? But there's also other components to that: fear of disease, right? Fear of contamination. And there's also the foreign element, right? There's a fear of a foreign invasion that you can definitely see in Victorian sensibilities. Dracula comes from Eastern Europe, right? And he comes to London. And, Eastern Europe at that time, that was the crazy place where everybody's coming with all these different values, and they're coming to our place, and we don't like them. That was a lot of times, I think, what the overall society. I'm not saying that this is what Bram Stoker was trying to portray, but what he was wrestling with is this idea that this exists in our society, and we have a character like a Dracula who invades into the heart of the British Empire, and he doesn't just kill, he corrupts, he infects, right? So it's really, you can see how it's really infecting Victorian society, which is really obsessed and repressed in many ways, has all these norms of sexual restraint and proper behavior, and the right social image, and he represents this hidden desire of breaking through that repression. So I think that's why this novel still really works as a very symbolic monster, right? But monsters don't attack society from the outside, the best monsters. What they do is they reveal what is happening within the society, right? You have in the ancient version, when we look at the Cyclops in Polyphemus in the Odyssey, blank there for a moment, that obviously is more of an external fear, right? Dracula becomes more of an internal fear. I think that as society advances, you see these changes all throughout, though. Like when I look forward and see in like the 70s, as society is becoming more secular, now a lot of villains are like it's ghosts and possession and a lot of this kind of thing, right? The Exorcist is an example, right? It's not just about possession, it's about the the collapse of normative spirituality at the time. And there was all sorts of anxieties tied to this. The breakdown of the family, the loss of certainty and religion and and the idea that institutions that had carried throughout the 50s and 60s were falling apart, right? People were not trusting the institutions. You really see this in The Exorcist, right? It's yeah, right. The psychiatrists and the doctors and all the modern methods, they don't work. They don't help, right? And you have to resort to these the more spiritual methods. And it's an interesting exploration of the fear of that society, that particular time. And of course, that's not the only thing that we explored in the 70s. There's also all sorts of great fiction works that have monsters and that are very secular, that are not spiritual at all. They're very psychopathic and serial killers. Again, we mentioned earlier The Silence of the Lambs. This is another one within that time period, right? So there can be multiple fears within a society at the same time. But I think horror really shifted from that external to the internal to the idea that civilization, like in the case of Dracula, is what saves. It doesn't, maybe that might not work anymore, right? Maybe we have to resort to the old gods, or we have to go to some new thing. Um, but the really interesting thing I see is the mythic kind of the villain that becomes in the modern era, the one we don't know about. Hannibal Lecter is a good example of where this started, right? You don't really know much about his background. Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men, to me, is an even better example. He's terrifying because he feels just totally unknowable. You have no idea where he comes from. I think a lot of modern films over-explain their villains. They give you all these backgrounds. They had this happened when they were a kid, and they had all these traumas, and we're trying to humanize the villains so much. Like we totally understand everything they do, and they're no longer even really a villain. And they might even have redemption arcs, and it's just a hero who had a bad childhood, and then inside he's really a hero, and he's going to become a hero. And that, I'm not trying to degrade that. That can be an interesting story to explore as well. But there's something really compelling about, and terrifying too, about the hero or the villain that defies explanation. There's no reason, there's no rationale. They're hyper intelligent, cultured. They're detached from morality. They don't care, right? That cold, philosophical, almost inevitability. And that's what Anton Chigurh is. He feels like, the angel of death, right? He's just a force of nature. And he's coming. And there's nothing you could do about it, right? Like, that is what McCarthy really understood in this work. And so, anyways, I've gone way over, on all sorts of tangents with this one, but, I want to end this video by really exploring what I think some of the greatest villains are. And maybe in a future video, I'll go more into depth and really write this down. But there's a number of villains that come to mind, why they're so compelling. We could write whole books on. The first one is Iago from Othello. I think Iago is possibly the greatest villain in literature. He's certainly one of the most influential villains. And there are whole books written just on this. So, I say a book could be written on it, but they already have been. Othello is a really important play, but it's one where, Shakespeare often has very great main characters. Hamlet, Macbeth. Othello is fine, but Iago is the core of the story of Othello, right? He's the puppet master, the manipulator. He manipulates everybody, right? And he's probably the greatest villain ever written because he just doesn't have a motive, right? It's malice that Shakespeare doesn't explain to us, which is really terrifying. I mean, we get a little bit, we get touches of explanation, but they're not satisfying. And I think it just deeply influenced so many other great villains, like Satan in Paradise Lost, for example. You can see the direct line of influence into Iago. But anyways, Dracula is another one that I mentioned. The cultural anxiety transformed into this monster, the foreign, corrupting, internal, like blood-sucking, hyper-sexualized, in a very repressive way, death and, coming back to life. And it's very compelling. And it's a very great story, very great novel, but just there's a reason that so many films and movies are still made about that. We talked about Anton Chigurh, we talked about Hannibal Lecter, the kind of civilizational predator. And Chigurh would be more like, I don't know how you would think about it, maybe like fate. He's like fate coming for you again, but in a modern sense. A lot of the fate characters are older, and this is yeah. But another one that I really love is, so Stephen King writes some really great villains. I think a lot of times, I haven't talked much about King on this channel, and I hope to in the future because I really do enjoy his work, and I think he's a great writer. I think he also writes really well about how to write, but even when we look beyond his compelling introductions and explanations of how to write great villains, he's written some really good ones. Now, don't get me wrong, It and The Stand are fantastic novels. He's got so many great stories that I would look at the villain and say, Pennywise is kind of an interesting villain. Yeah, in The Stand, kind of interesting. But some of his villains, when they're personifications of evil, it's too big for me. I think his best villain is Annie Wilkes, to be honest, from Misery. And I think the reason for this is because she feels so real. This obsessive fan, like it's a great idea. It's really, I don't think it would be going too far to say there was at least a small stroke of genius in this. And I think probably came in part from experiences that King himself had. She's just this possessive lover, wants to control, really creepy, because it's something like a nurse that's supposed to help you, but it's really like, what is that disorder called? Munchausen by proxy kind of idea. Emotional instability. That is just what is on the surface. Oh, she's being kind, she's being nice, but really she's just crazy, right? And I think that represents the modern horror of losing freedom, losing autonomy. So that's a great one. But all of these villains endure. And the greatest, I guess my conclusion here will be that the greatest villains are never just evil, right? They they embody these cultural fears that we have. Um, in the ancient times, chaos was a fear. So you have the Cyclops, and in the Victorian times, it's internal corruption and foreign invasion and sexual norms, and so you have the vampire. In the modern society, we fear many things. So we have many monsters that represent our very fractured world. Meaninglessness, manipulation, collapse. That's just the beginning of the list, right? But every society, every era creates the monsters that it needs or that it deserves. And I think that's why they stay with us so long. We we forget sometimes the villains and remember the monsters. Now, there's one interesting exception to this in the case of Frankenstein, where we remember the monster, Frankenstein's monster, by the name Frankenstein, who is the doctor who created the monster. But I think that's very telling because the truth is, Victor Frankenstein, I think, is the villain, right? He is the one who's the villain of that story. So we are actually saying it right. We're just misremembering that it's the scary monster that's the villain. That's the horror, right? That's the scary part, but the evil part is the creation, the going beyond the limits. Anyways, just thought I would add that in there, but we totally misunderstand villains so often, right? Because we're thinking through the lens of the heroes, and villains, they show us so much about the truth of our society, what we need to be afraid of, what we are afraid of, what we don't know that we're afraid of, and the challenges that we have to overcome. The heroes are just, they're stand-ins. They could be a POV, right? The character of the hero, to me, much less important. Anyways, I'm curious what your favorite villain in literature is, what you think are some of the villains that really represent our modern society. If you stayed this long, and what villains are really unforgettable for you. It's something I've been thinking about a lot, and I'm very interested. So, anyways, if you're still with us, I really appreciate you watching to the end of this video. I know it was a bit of a rambling one, but I was just thinking about this earlier today, and I thought this would be a really interesting thing to explore. If you guys like this kind of video, please let me know. Please like and subscribe, and leave a comment below about what your favorite and most compelling villains are, and why you think villains are so much more compelling than heroes. Anyways, take care and keep reading.